Don't just take antidepressants, find the cause. Today we're talking about antidepressant therapy. Dr. Hart, do you see any depression in Tennessee?
Almost everyone who comes in the office, unfortunately, when we deal with complex chronic illness, depression's always going to be a part of it. I think what's the saddest point, and you obviously, I know being a psychiatrist, which I know is not you like to make your first name, but I know you see it, is how often a patient comes in and they've been basically told you're probably anxious or depressed. There's nothing else wrong with you, so let's put you on an antidepressant. And maybe it helps a little because yeah, they're depressed because they've had a complex chronic illness that no one can figure out. But it never seems to be the actual solution that we're finding.
I mean, even Western medicine admits antidepressant therapy, when used appropriately and correctly, only works between 30 and 40% of the time. Placebo effect, of course, is hovering around 30%. Those are very troubling statistics because
Yeah.
they clearly point at that gap between placebo and the actual pharmacotherapy as being very, very narrow. I look at it differently. I look at it, it's an F in every school that I went to, and 70% of the people out there I'm failing because of
Yeah.
my ignorance. So, thinking as an engineer, when I approach medicine and I ask the question why, I realized very quickly, probably the same day of medical school, you don't ask why. You don't ask why in medical school and training or in practice.
So
It's
sad.
very,
Mhm.
very rarely mentioned. Your whole life is asking why. I think that's what's so great. That's one of the big differences I like about nurse practitioners over classically trained medical doctors or, um, osteopathy as compared to allopaths because or functional medicine, integrative health, holistic approaches in general, because they ask why.
Yeah.
If it didn't matter, it wouldn't be such a big issue. It wouldn't be such a big point. But typically, I see people come in and they've been on at least 3 to 10 antidepressants, just looking at that one class,
Yeah.
and they look to me as if, geez, I hope he's watched more TV than I have, or my last doctor, so that he knows what's the latest, greatest thing. And
Yeah.
everything about that is wrong because it doesn't ask why. It assumes that the next intervention is going to be somehow different than the others. And after 3 antidepressants, the chances of a fourth one working are lower than 5%, which is
Oh my
worse than
gosh.
pancreatic cancer, glioblastoma, brain
Yeah.
cancer. That's shocking. So finding the cause has been one of the greatest tools that I've had to help people, and probably one of the most rewarding things I've encountered in my whole career. And educational and humbling because
Yeah.
so many things cause what we call depression.
Yeah.
You see it, I'm sure, in when you're doing more manipulation, more chiropractic, you see these emotional releases. I talk to massage therapists, I talk to all, and I ask them, like, what is that? Where's that coming from? What do you do about that? What does it mean? Because
Yeah.
it's very fascinating.
Yeah. I mean, the short term we call it is trapped emotions, right? But we know the scientific side of that, that's the research side, is that every emotion, every feeling you feel in your body. And the reason for that is sure, neurotransmitters are there, but there's also what they found as neuropeptides. So each emotion state, each feeling state has a certain cocktail of neuropeptides that get released. That's why you feel it in your body. But if those aren't processed, if those emotional experiences and emotional states aren't fully dealt with and processed in that real time, the body, number one, has to store some of those neuropeptides. And then every cell, especially the neurological components of the cells, but every cell stores a certain sort of like almost like a holographic memory. And so, because it's trying to protect it for the next time. And so that joint, that muscle tissue, that organ, etc., is going to store that whole event, neuroemotional cascade and neuropeptides in that area. So then when you do like chiropractic manipulation, when you do massage or different release work like that,
Um,
people a lot of times will have that emotional release because you're releasing those neuropeptides. You're activating that hologram to be released now in real time in a relaxing state. So we know, like, for instance, massage lowers cortisol, the stress hormone. We know chiropractic adjustments, they release endorphins and enkephalins and they increase stimulation to the brain that's creating this state that allows it to process and integrate in real time. And it's almost a joke with the staff and my wife. They say, you're not really a patient of Dr. Hart, so you end up crying on the table, not because you have to cry, but just because it happens so often that an emotional release occurs, especially when we do focused emotional release work in the room in order to help a patient clear that sort of stuff.
Yeah, and when you're talking about focused emotional release, that's very similar to the late Dr. Schulman's work in synchronized
Mhm.
synergistic therapy, because it relies on that fundamental point you just made as the principle and the mechanism, not only of diagnostics, but of the treatment, and in this case, the healing of it.
Yeah.
Because it's, a physiologic state like depression or mold or Lyme or whatever should be temporary.
Yes. Yeah.
Whereas some longer term things like dementia, they're more palliative, but they still have tremendous utility. Even if if you're totally unable to speak or hear, there's still a lot that we can do that influence our emotion. Not, maybe not even as complex if you can't transport them to there. There might be sound therapy, aromatherapy, touch
Yeah.
therapy is really, really helpful in those folks. So understanding the why of the depression. Is this a problem with the hardware? Is this a problem with the software? Is this a problem with the terrain? That is a question that, in my opinion, every psychiatrist should be trained on. Why go to medical school otherwise? Is it so I
Yeah.
know to check your thyroid? Anyone can check your thyroid.
Yeah.
They don't even really talk about adrenals. Why talk about thyroid if we're not going to talk about adrenals?
All on the same axis. Yeah.
So the depression isn't the antidepressant approach is not enough, and it should only be employed when you think the benefits outweigh the risks. Well, that changes from provider to provider. For me, I've got to go through a mental Rolodex of ruling out causes.
Yeah.
And I don't always get there. Sometimes it's too urgent. Sometimes it's someone's too suicidal. It's too acute. We're doing more heroic measures, brain stimulation, ketamines, really rapid inpatient titration of medications in an observed state.
Yeah.
But for most people, like you said, it seems like everyone's walking around with depression. It's looking at the what's causing it. Is it that they're drinking and smoking, meth every day? Or is it that they're going through a divorce or a loss? Is it something that's a biotoxin illness, or is it
Mhm.
toxicokinetic physiologic state, which is it from a medical condition like Parkinson's? All of those need to be looked at.
Yes.
Otherwise, 70% of the time, and probably more, because remember I said that 70% were the appropriately treated
Yeah.
by the Western viewpoint. In my opinion, those 70% or the 30% were just dumb luck. The
Right.
70% was the inappropriate treatment. So we've got to change the way we approach and think about depression.
Well, it's really interesting to note that, the idea of antidepressants is really based on neurotransmitter theories, right? That it's neurotransmitters that are out of balance, a chemical imbalance in the brain, which may be chemical imbalance, but we don't know as much about that as we really like to pretend we do.
Yes.
Number one, which is huge on that front. And if we even want to agree with that fact, we've got to look at the fact that most antidepressants end up depleting the things that they're supposed to keep up. So like an SSRIs, that class, they never replenish the byproducts and actually burn up the byproducts that you need, for instance, to make serotonin. So it's really an incomplete theory, or incomplete treatment. But it goes to your point of, in no matter what type of medicine you do, whether it's holistic, natural, allopathic, integrative, you have to triage a situation, right? If somebody's coming to you in dire straits, if somebody's coming to me in a massively inflamed state, I can't be worrying about, if I've got their probiota right in the gut. I've got to deal with that inflammation first. If somebody's coming with massive depression to you who's suicidal, or you can't even get them out of bed to come do a treatment, you have to deal with that first, which might mean a heroic measure like an antidepressant or whatever for temporarily, because it gives you room to do that root cause medicine. It gives you that room to look for the true causes in that moment. And so, is there ways to naturally work with the neurotransmitters and things like that? There are, but even then, it's so low level of a treatment that we're missing the fact of why are they imbalanced in the first place? What's imbalanced in the chemicals? We know, for instance, that anxiety and depression, when they measure those folks' neuroinflammatory loads compared to healthy, happy controls, they have more neuroinflammation. Okay, well, are antidepressants dealing with that? Some do. Some do, honestly, but most of them don't. Most of them aren't handling that neuroinflammatory state. So what ends up happening is, well, Zoloft worked for the first year, but now it's not working. Why? Because the neuroinflammation is probably getting worse. So they've got to switch to a different antidepressant or SNRI or whatever. But if they would actually go back and deal with the inflammation, we could probably get them off of the antidepressant.
Yeah, and I mean, the important triage and an assessment includes, not just the origin of it, but also their natural health state, their attitude,
Mm-hmm.
um, their ongoing risk factors, and you draw attention and modify as much as possible. But at the end of the day, you better have a good idea why your treatment, or you're not going to get the what, because they
Yeah.
are not happy pills. That's one of my most frustrating things. People think, oh, this is a pill that contains happiness. I swallow it and therefore will manifest it.
Yeah.
It shocks me people think that, but we do. And nothing could be further from the truth. Like you said, assuming the serotonin hypothesis is correct for depression, although the only study I know that associated serotonin definitively was violent monkey suicides from the 1950s or something like that. The
Yeah.
dopamine hypothesis for not just psychosis, but addiction or ADHD, focus, attention, memory stuff. There is some truth to that, but it's not that it's low. You need more of this. These are extremely complex systems that are affected by millions of other connections and input, and then talk to each other. So different regions of the brain and different cell subtypes have different push-pull balances, and one medication might be biologically more compatible. So testing genetics and for personalized medicine is something I've done for a long time, but also is really important. I think people really need to look at what can I do to make sure depression doesn't start, because that would be your first goal. So avoid things that cause depression,
Yes.
downers, tranquilizers, alcohol, overexertion, hanging on to guilt, anger, trauma. The pills don't help for that. And another important point, and we learned this during the pandemic, is our usual bag of tricks aren't helping. So that 30% number, in my opinion, went down to about 5%. I think 5% of people have brain damage from the virus itself, which contributes not just to the whole host of symptoms that you hear on TV, but depression, certainly cognition, certainly anxiety, but definitely can include ADHD, psychosis, and all of that. I see tons of it. So making sure that we're all trying to prevent it, understand that there isn't a happy pill, and I want to look for the cause. You're much more likely to get out of that depression sooner and completely than before the pandemic even. And even then, a lot of those statistics were really low.
Yeah.
So our usual bag of tricks haven't worked. That includes medications, brain stimulation, psychotherapy. And then we're talking about deeper levels, existential, soul level, mind-body therapy itself, and the connection, and why the manipulation, or whether that's massage or adjustments, any sort of hands-on modality, is such a good treatment for depression. It's more obvious now than ever, and there should be a paradigm shift because of how much we learned really from the pandemic as well. It's changed so many things, not just this interaction and telemedicine in general, but it changed our cultural understanding of health and wellness and social policy and pandemic medicine and the idea of triage and diagnostic testing. Let's apply that to integrated health, and we would change the world. Well, you and I do this already, but
it would. It was a huge learning opportunity for us, really, on what's necessary or not in society and life and medicine, what's useful or not. where do things really lie on that front. And I loved kind of what you said about staying away from things that we know depress the brain. And I think number one, I want to make sure we don't forget to say this, that if dealing with neurotransmitters, 90% of them are made in the gut. So if you're dealing with depression, you need to look at the gut, number one. You talked about leaky gut with that. Huge, huge, huge. Like that stuff's all big, but is like we need to look at when you're depressed, the brain doesn't have the energy it needs to do what it needs to do. Right. And so a lot of times that's an oversimplification, but you can kind of boil it down to that. And so partially, and you can go check out Dr. Marks and I, other alt psych podcast on COVID brain. Highly recommend that. We talked a ton about this, but so much of that COVID brain deals with like a cell danger response or a depletion of energetics in those cells. And so things that are creating energy. And so we got to look at, are you doing things that drain energy from your brain? Okay, you're depleting the brain of energy or the things that create energy. So for instance, if you're drinking all the time, it's a sedative, but it also depletes thiamine, right? So we need thiamine to replenish nerves and nerve growth and nerve function. Okay, so it's going to deplete that B1. And so are you depleting the brain's ability to even make energy, to make neural connections, et cetera? And so look at energetics. What are the things that take away from the brain's energy? What are the things that add to the brain's energy? And so are you doing those things in the right system? And if you do have depression, looking at those foundational things, which I loved hearing you talk about, and then any therapeutic intervention you're going to have can then come from that same format. So even like you're talking about the TMS, I think you're talking about, right? The transcranial magnetic stimulation, that's an energetics thing. That's changing the brain's energetics, right? And so it's stimulating different areas. And by stimulating, you're waking it up. You're adding energy to that system. And so in a therapeutic standpoint, what are you doing to change the brain's energetics to allow it to functioning in a way that is balanced, modulated, but stimulatory in the right areas?
Yeah, and I mean that's one of the reasons why psychotherapy works, is because it's changing energetics through changing thought, like cognitive behavioral therapy specifically.
Yeah.
We know it works. We don't fundamentally understand why, and I think it has to do with thought, intent, action, and retraining, cognitive reframing, like catching people when they say things like, "Oh, I'm such an idiot." I see
Yeah.
people get out of my office, I stop them, and I say, like, "Do you really mean that?"
Right.
Why do you talk to yourself like that? You wouldn't talk to me like that. A lot of people do, but
I don't know any of them,
so
but
mind is
yes.
over matter in that regards. In this case, it's consciousness, it's visualization, it's meditation, it's calming and clearing the mind energetically, like you said. Uh,
Yes. Oh yeah.
Whereas matter is the antidepressant pill. So
Exactly.
I like mind over matter.
Well, it's not, the cool part is, that idea you're talking about there, mind over matter, intentionality, visualization, none of that's woo woo, right? None of that. At this point, we've done the brain scans, we've done the
Mhm.
SPECT scans, we've done the EEGs, we've done all of that. And we can see that when you deal visualization, different parts of the brain light up that improve happiness, optimism, focus, attention. We can see that when you do things like, tapping, when you do things like deep breathing, meditative work, when you do things with intentionality, or even CBT therapy, they do brain scans on those people and they
Mhm.
look at how they're shifting their cognitive distortions, where they're calling out those things like, hey, I'm not going to call myself an idiot. I'm going to recognize I'm doing my best. Those actually create brain changes in those scans. When they do functional MRIs, those areas shift that we light up. That's none of that's woo woo or out there at this point. It's completely validated. And so it's if you're not using that in this approach, then frankly, you're not using evidence-based medicine anymore.
Yeah, and cell biologists are like to say cells that fire together wire together, and that's usually in reference to learning and memory. I always think of it as pathological states. So if I'm in a depression and I've got these limbic structures in my brain that are just half asleep or mostly asleep, I've got really low functioning, and the longer that depression goes untreated, the longer the cells wire together in this depressed hologram, like you were saying.
Yes. Yeah.
So there's an urgency to avoid it, recognize it early, and appropriately treat it. And
Yes.
I think as a culture right now, I wish we were 100 years in the future, because we don't do very good with that. And I think
No.
that's why we see a lot of bigger problems,
Yeah.
on a society level, not just the divorce and personal finance and losing your job, but larger scale things like mass shootings and corporate greed and medicalization, industrialization,
Yeah.
weaponization. It's really a testament to the mind body connection that it can heal itself better than antidepressants, but you got to
Yes.
know how to find the pressure point.
You do, and I think, I think that's really the key, and I want to drive that home is this idea that if we could learn to assess this early and handle this early, it's world changing, right? I think fundamentally, to me, antidepressant theory is basically based on this idea of shut up, get. I don't really want you happy. Get functional enough that you can get back to work, get back to spending money, get back to consuming, etc. And it's really focused on the idea of get back to being a cog in the machine. And what we're kind of saying is, do this differently. Wake up, change the world by changing your own physiology, your own neurology, your own psychology, and do something different so you can change your life and change the lives of the people around you by doing that. Don't just sedate yourself or medicate yourself to being okay with the humdrums of your life again, right? And by humdrums, I don't just mean like stress or like your emotional state either. I mean all of it. If you're sick, if you've got a chronic illness, or if you've got these other things inside that are making you depressed, and you take an antidepressant that makes you functional again, you will not change the environment around you. You will not deal with the stressful boss. You will not deal with the toxic relationship. You will not deal with the trauma because you're fine. You've numbed yourself into functionality again. But if what we're saying is wake up, deal with the trauma, deal with the stressors, start taking care of yourself, deal with these low-level infections and inflammation, do something different, that's fundamentally life-changing for you, those around you, and then eventually, as Mother Teresa said, when we all clean our own porch, the whole world is clean. It's world-changing at that point.
Dr. Hart, thanks for your time. We'll see you next week.
Be well.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about.